Have you ever asked yourself, am I a gamer or a gambler? If not, it may be high time that you do. Making games is hard. Taking a chance on a crowdfunded game is risky. But when developers are ambitious, passionate, and experienced, the will to support them and help them realize their vision is understandably a lot higher. However, even when it comes to the most promising of projects, there's still a pretty strong chance things will go bad. There are plenty of games that get their first lease on life via crowdfunding sites like Kickstarter, but in many cases, if these titles ever see the light of day, it's only for a short duration, and then they get shut down, never to be seen or heard from again. This arguably couldn't be any truer than in the world of MMOs, and while we can choose from one of several examples, possibly the most tragic and interesting tale in recent years comes in the form of Crowfall, a now defunct MMO that was announced at the beginning of 2015 and went offline on November 22, 2022. So what exactly happened with Crowfall, and are crowdfunded and early access games actually worth the risk? Join us as we dig deeper and uncover the truth behind the downfall of Crowfall. So Crowfall's origins can be traced all the way back to January 2015 with a website called playtocrush.com that got a lot of people super hyped since they soon figured out that J. Todd Coleman, the creator of Shadowbane, would be heading up the project. Then in March 2015, a Kickstarter campaign for Crowfall began, and while the devs only asked for $800,000, they managed to receive just a few $1,000s shy of $1.8 million in funding from close to 17,000 backers. For some context, backers could contribute as little as $5,000 or up to $10,000, with 15 individuals contributing the maximum amount. In other words, 15 backers contributed 8.5% of the Kickstarter funds for Crowfall. Pretty crazy. However, although $1.8 million may sound like a lot of money, the Crowfall team managed to raise around $50 million throughout the course of the game's development from outside investors. In essence, the Kickstarter campaign was meant to prove to investors that there was indeed a demand for Crowfall, and it was also supposed to ensure that creative control remained in the hands of the devs, which makes sense in theory. Then when Crowfall entered its early testing phase, it started with a Battle Royale mode set in a white sandbox environment that was known as Hunger Dome. What is interesting to note here is that this game type came out 2 full years before PUBG and Fortnite, which really makes you wonder what could have been achieved if things had gone differently. Anyway, the focus in Hunger Dome was on achieving combat that felt kinetic and intense and gave a lot of consideration towards physics and made use of real projectiles. But in light of the complexity and lag this approach often leads to in MMORPGs, it was abandoned in favor of a split body model which allowed for more fluid real-time combat. Testing progressed, and time was devoted to evaluating things like wall physics and building out the skills tree system. Later on, a persistent online world became available, allowing players to explore and interact with the environment. Then largely lagless 25v25 combat was achieved, forts became a feature, and performance improvements were made. While the game loop was still relatively primitive at this point, Crowfall's core mechanics were mostly there and something the vast majority of players seemed to enjoy. Then 2020 rolled around, and the COVID pandemic hit. However, this didn't really affect Crowfall's development all that much as testing began on the dregs, which allowed gamers to play Crowfall as it was meant to be played. Guilds could go up against other guilds, and everything from crafting and harvesting now formed part of the experience. Crowfall was by no means feature complete and still pretty rough-hewn, but the game was playable and even something players could enjoy. Then in August 2020, Crowfall went into its beta, and with new updates coming in regularly and the fact that content felt fresh and fun, it would appear that many players were very happy with the experience and where the game was headed. For all intents and purposes, things were on the up and up for Crowfall and its fanbase. Then Hunger Dome suddenly reappeared as a game mode, which was a little confusing for some players as this just seemed to come out of nowhere. But since it did guarantee some good PvP combat, it was assumed that there was some intention to build out this system and make it more of a feature in the future. However, after the conclusion of the ECS tournament, Hunger Dome basically disappeared and was never seen again. After this, Crowfall saw its official launch on July 6, 2021, and while there weren't as many players joining up to participate as initially hoped, there were more players than ever before and, once again, it looked like Crowfall's future was more or less assured, or at least it seemed that way. Sadly, it wasn't long after launch that the big problems with Crowfall's marketing and gameplay started to come into focus. To call Crowfall's marketing lackluster would be an understatement, and believe it or not, many of the people who had backed the Kickstarter campaign didn't even know Crowfall had been released. That should say more than enough, but since little to no budget was dedicated towards making people aware of Crowfall's existence, it would never really get the numbers it required to remain sustainable. On top of all this, the many issues with in-game combat started to become very apparent. For instance, it was possible to have alliances of up to 2,500 players. Since 5 guilds could form alliances, and each of those guilds could consist of 500 players, this meant that battles began to ramp up in scale in a massive way. As you can well imagine, this meant a lot of the fighting that took place during and shortly after launch was really laggy, chaotic, and just plain baffling. Then there was Crowfall's whole siege system, which meant that between 2 or 3 times a week, any of your forts or keeps could come under attack. So you and your guild would need to get online and wait patiently in case an attack happened. So yeah, if your guild consisted of hundreds of players, you and pretty much all of your pals would need to get online and wait around in anticipation of an attack that may not even happen. In the vast majority of cases, no attack would ever occur, so the term no-show sieges soon became a thing. This would happen over and over again, and then when people stopped bothering to wait and defend their keeps, an attack would actually end up taking place. You can only imagine how this must have frustrated and enraged Crowfall players, since if they didn't log on just to be present in the game, they ran the risk of being punished severely, and in most cases were. And even when players were in their keeps and people attacked, the combat was just terrible and not fun at all. And in almost every situation, whichever group had the most players in a battle would win pretty much every single time. So if an attacking force was even a little greater than yours by a small margin, your chances of success were minimal at best. Beyond this, because so much of the world in Crowfall was procedurally generated, there was no way to really optimize it to improve in-game performance. And the thing is, even when just running around with little going on in the environment, the frame rate would suddenly drop to 30 or 40 and then pick back up to 60, basically for no reason whatsoever. It makes for a really disruptive and tiring gaming experience, so coupled with the other issues, this caused many gamers to simply become fatigued all too quickly. But this isn't where the trouble ends, at all. Harvesting and crafting in Crowfall was absolutely trash and required way too many people to make it worthwhile. A lot of gamers would end up making numerous accounts just so they wouldn't have to rely on others, but naturally this meant having to do a lot of work and switching between accounts to get stuff done. Add a very demanding inventory management system and never really knowing where all your stuff is, and what you have on your hands is nothing short of a nightmare. If you didn't want to harvest and craft, you'd have to trade with other players, but because you'd have to physically interact with them in the world and couldn't trade across factions or guilds, this was similarly painful and ultimately not worth the effort. I could actually go on about how endlessly tiresome trading was in Crowfall, but I'll spare you the gory details for now. But arguably the single biggest problem with Crowfall was its entire lack of small-scale PvP, which was actually what so many players were most excited about in the first place. Once guilds had everything they needed and built their keeps, going out and exploring the world of Crowfall was mostly pointless. All the most important events in the game happen in large groups, so when these big battles weren't taking place, people would just log out to save their gear and wait for times when they could score big and take part in things that they believed were actually important. And who can blame them? Small guilds just didn't have any impact in Crowfall and didn't fundamentally matter. And since most players belonged to smaller guilds, they simply became jaded and decided to abandon Crowfall for good. So what really killed Crowfall then is that not nearly enough time and attention was given to improving the situation for the average player. Since a lot of the backers who contributed a lot towards Crowfall's development belonged to larger guilds, their needs were attended to first, or even exclusively, often to the detriment of the larger community and their experience. So really, it isn't that the devs didn't listen, it's just that they didn't listen to everyone and only entertained some problems while totally ignoring others. Oof. So ultimately Crowfall was purchased by a company called Monumental, who have taken the game into closed development, but whether anything meaningful will come of this remains to be seen. But what Crowfall reveals is that, with early access and Kickstarter games, you are at best an investor and, more realistically, a gambler. And to be clear, most MMOs, especially crowdfunded ones, don't actually succeed. There are way more failures than successes, and for a lot of gamers, the juice just isn't worth the squeeze. And since games are essentially ecosystems, if the top of the food chain is too dictatorial and starves whatever is at the bottom, the whole thing is literally doomed to fail. This is probably why Steven Weber of MMORPG.com declared that the Kickstarter MMO is dead in an article published on the site in March 2023. But whether it's pre-orders, early access, crowdfunding, or otherwise, gamers all over are sick and tired of being taken for a ride or being promised the earth and receiving next to nothing instead. Whether many of us know it or not, when we buy into an idea or a promise, we're not gamers, we're gamblers and cash cows. That's just the sad reality that so many people have woken up to, and many are waking up to every single day. There are a few more in-depth videos on the story of Crowfall available on YouTube if you want to find out more, and I highly recommend Zyback TV's analysis as well as Nerdslayer Studios if you really want the full detailed story. They're both well worth checking out. And so here ends today's video, fam. What do you think of crowdfunded and early access games? And were you ever a backer of a Kickstarter game like Crowfall? Let us know in the comments. Be sure to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel for daily gaming, VR and tech content. From me and the crew, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.